It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Baltimore. Ongoing anti-government protests in Sudan, which have lasted for over a month now, have claimed the lives of at least 40 protesters, and there have been over 1,000 arrests so far. According to the Sudanese Central Doctors Committee, doctors are now calling for a boycott of police and military hospitals because doctors themselves have become targets of government repression when they treat injured protesters. Also, teachers will join the doctors in a solidarity strike next week. Meanwhile, Sudan's president, Omar Al-Bashir, traveled to Qatar on Tuesday, where he is looking for financial support for his cash-strapped government. Joining me now from Boston to make sense of what is happening in Sudan is Alex de Waal. Alex is executive director of the World Peace Foundation and a research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Thanks for joining us again, Alex.
You're very welcome.
So people in Sudan have been demonstrating for more or less a month continuously now. What is going on? How have these protests developed, and what are they protesting against?
Well, the first thing to say is that in Sudan, as in elsewhere in the Arab world, the only way in which authoritarian rulers have ever been brought down is by large-scale, non-violent popular protests. They've never been removed by civil war or other mechanisms. It has always either begun or culminated in this type of popular uprising. And Sudan itself had two such events in its history. In 1964, they overthrew a dictatorship. In 1985, similarly. And this really is the model for the uprising that we see today. Bear in mind that we have a ruler, a military ruler, who has been in power for almost 30 years. The median age of Sudanese is about 20. It's only people who are 50 years old who have ever had the chance to vote in a truly free and fair election back in 1986. President Bashir took power in 1989 when the Berlin Wall was still standing. So for most Sudanese, he is really the relic of a bygone era, and they simply want change. And the particular driver for this change is the deterioration in the country's economy, which is due primarily to corruption, just massive corruption at the top of government. Not only President Bashir, and more particularly the people around him, stealing large amounts of money, but also particularly they're taking money in order to pay off their political networks, in order to bribe the security services, bribe senior army officers, in order for them to have a financial incentive to stay on side and support the government. And ordinary people, understandably, are utterly fed up of this. So there is a very broad societal consensus that this is the time when Bashir really has finally to go.
Now, it seems like there's a serious economic issue as well. I mean, for a long time, the countries of the West had imposed sanctions on Sudan. Those have been lifted, or were lifted about 2 years ago, at least from the U.S. and others. But now, of course, with the partition of Sudan, I'm wondering if you could say something about that. I mean, it seems like the South Sudan was the more oil-rich part of Sudan, and it seceded. So what's the economic situation like now, and is that also a factor in the protests that have been developing?
Absolutely so. I mean, Sudan had an economic boom when oil was first exported, and starting in 1999, a massive sort of growth in the economy in the 10 years that followed that, and continuing prosperity for a while. But South Sudan, which has about 3/4 of the oil, seceded in 2011, 8 years ago. And the major source of foreign currency and the driver of the economic boom was therefore pulled away. The rug was pulled out from under the economic feet of Sudan. And one of the things that the Obama administration, and indeed the Bush administration before that, had promised to Omar al-Bashir was that if you go along with certain steps, cooperating with us on counter-terrorism, making peace with South Sudan, allowing South Sudan to secede, then we will lift sanctions. And each time the Sudanese actually went ahead and did what they promised, and the US changed the goalposts. They wouldn't lift sanctions. And finally, which means that the administration, as indeed the previous administration, they have a little bit of sympathy for Bashir because the administration wanted to lift the sanctions. It was Congress, because of the pressure of the Save Darfur coalition and other lobbies, who said, no, don't do this, don't compromise, put in another set of preconditions before you lift sanctions. So finally, when sanctions were lifted 2 years ago, it was really too late. And also by that time, this cabal of kleptocrats around the president had grown so deeply entrenched, they were simply gobbling up any extra resources that came into the country. And as a result, people are unable to afford basic necessities, fuel, and even in the last few months, bread.
Well, as you mentioned now, President Omar Al-Bashir has been in office for almost 30 years now. And in 2009, the International Criminal Court indicted him for genocide because of the Darfur conflict. What is his hold on power like now? And is there any chance that he might either be forced out of office or step down in light of these recent protests?
Well, one of the tragic consequences of the arrest warrant for President Bashir for those charges over Darfur is that he has no safe way of stepping down. And in fact, for some years, he's wanted to step down, but because he's been tired, he's not been in good health. But he knows that if he leaves office, it's very likely that a successor government will hand him over to the ICC. So he's really been backed into a corner, and I think this is one of the really unfortunate, counterproductive outcomes of that arrest warrant. So what he really has been very effective in doing is building what we would call a coup-proof system, a system that can protect him from a military coup. So he has a very tight control over the senior echelons of the army, and his particular personal and political skill is he knows the army officer corps individually, one by one. He's a very personable character. He has an encyclopedic memory for people, their families, their personal circumstances, and he uses that very skillfully to keep on top of army politics. And he also has another insurance system, which is the National Intelligence and Security Services, that keeps an eye on the army as well as on the population in general, and also has a very powerful firepower, so that if some army officers were to say, it's time for us to stand with the people, there's a danger that they might come into armed conflict between them and the National Intelligence and Security. So Bashir is still has a few cards to play, and the great worry of many Sudanese and many observers is that in playing these cards, he may spark yet another civil war in Sudan, and this time a civil war not just in the far-flung rural areas like the south and in Darfur, but actually in the main cities themselves.
Now, it seems that this conflict that's going on right now has received very little media attention, and as a matter of fact, Western governments seem to have hardly expressed any interest in getting involved. Why is that?
I think there are two main reasons. A general reason is that the aftermath of the Arab Spring popular uprisings, everyone was very enthusiastic. You get rid of a dictator like Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, or Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or Gaddafi in Libya, and we'll have democracy. And it didn't really turn out that way. So people are more frightened of the chaos that might follow than the devil that we know, which is Bashir. But for the US, there's another very particular reason, which is that the United States has been very much invested in South Sudan and in trying to get peace in South Sudan. And ironically enough, the key intermediary who designed the peace agreement that is now in place for the warring parties in South Sudan, for that civil war, is Bashir himself. He is the one who actually stepped in with his detailed knowledge of South Sudan, his leverage over the parties, and said, I will work out a peace deal, which he has done. And so the US is very reluctant to see that peace deal jeopardized by the overthrow of Bashir, however much they dislike him, however much they see him as a relic from the past and as a problem for the future.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but we'll definitely come back as the situation develops. I was speaking to Alex de Waal, research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Thanks again, Alex, for having joined us.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.